Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction, and please do use Slido to provide lots of questions and stuff, and we'll try and get to them. Obviously, triage is 100% not a controversial topic, but it has something that's recently raised its head in terms of accuracy, consistency, how are we training, what models should we have, who should be at the front door, who should be at the back door, does it matter, do we need 5 levels, 3 levels, or should it just be first in, best dressed? This project actually started about 4 years ago. I love technology. I love its primary function, which is to do the things that are repetitive but do it faster and better without emotion. So 4 years ago, a colleague and I, Alistair Hodges, a nurse practitioner at St George, who was the former CNC at Prince of Wales, thought, we're reviewing all these triages, and it's either done by paper or it's on some dodgy Excel somewhere. We all know how to make graphs, but I can't look back 4 years. I can't tell who's doing what. And just echoing Michael's comments, we have so much drive towards e-health, but we have very little analytical capacity built in. It's, at the moment, here's an Excel dump, do what you want with that, or we can give you a number. So it's not very creative, and we thought, actually, maybe we could do something better. So we all know that triage is the first and continuing point of contact for patients. It's also the first point of assessment and decision-making, and it ensures that patients are treated within a timely fashion based on their urgency. But there's a lot of judgment involved in here, and historically, triage was done on best guess. It was even done by AMBOs and clerical staff, and then we had the National Triage Scale, and it became the ATS scale, and there's about 5 recognised triage scales around the world. When we started to think about this, we taught people how to do triage, and we thought we were doing a fantastic job, and we used the standard resources that have been out there for nearly 12 years now. That's the ETEC and the ASIM guideline G24. But we couldn't see the gaps, we couldn't see particular presenting problems where our issues lay, and generally we were reactive. We had to be told that there was a problem before we sort of got involved. We thought we need to change that. And we started looking at the literature, and lo and behold, there is an absence of any standardized audit framework out there at all. ETEC hasn't been updated since the day it was born. And something that I found quite surprising when we did a survey, and I'll give you some results of that, only 3% knew that the ASIM guideline was updated last year. There was no communication of that whatsoever, and so most of us, if you were trained 10, 15 years ago to do triage, you were ETEC, but the variables in ETEC are very different from what are now out in the world. And we have lots of other things coming at the side, chest pain, strokes, and at risk. Everything's coming in and saying it should be this category. So it's starting to snipe a little bit. So we thought, okay, look, let's explore technology. What can we do with technology? We have a data set. We should be able to use some of this. And we wanted to do a few things. We wanted to make it quick, efficient, and just like any database, you should be able to search backwards and forwards. You should be able to search inside the record, outside the record, and you should be able to produce some results that guide what you're going to be doing in the next 6 weeks or 3 weeks. We also found that, shockingly, a lot of the audit practices weren't fed back to individual nurses that were new to triage. Could auditing be a learning tool? And from our study, it definitely can be. We tried this a few ways, and what we first noticed was that if you knew who the triage nurse's name was, you were completely biased, because we started to say to ourselves, oh, they would have done that. I know that person. When in actual fact, when we look at triages, they form the majority of RCA questions. Was this triage category appropriate? And it's a very objective question that's raised there. We also wanted to decrease the time it takes to do audits. We don't want people going backwards and forwards. So we put a system together, and this is its new version. It's now version 2. And these are a couple of screenshots, and I'll get into some data, but the audit screen's on the left-hand side. You read the triage data. It's completely de-identified. You see the gender and age, but that is it, and then the details are within it, and you select the supporting evidence for the category that you believe this should be. There's a note space there as well. We've kept it to, and Twitter beat us, it's 255 characters. They've gone for 288. But we've also built in graphs. You can actually, these are produced automatically, because what we wanted was a system that works in metro, that works in rural, that works in remote, and you don't have to have a high degree of skill with using Excel data sets. The program should do it for you, and that's what we've built. So we thought, we need to test it. So we approached 5 random EDs, and they agreed to give us their data. We got our auditors, we blinded them to the allocation. The great thing about TCAS, it does that automatically. The auditors themselves were senior emergency nurses. They routinely teach triage, they routinely audit triage, and we thought, okay, we've got a good set, we'll grab those. We had 3 metro, 1 regional, 1 rural, and they had an average presentation of about 50,000 a year, some in the smaller numbers there. And we pulled 2,000 in total, but we ended up using 1,350 triage records. And to those, we developed 20 mock triages. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen E-Tech. E-Tech triage examples are very recognizable as soon as you see them. There's no spelling mistakes, there's got accurate punctuation, there's no abbreviations in there. So we thought we can't use that because it will stand out like a sore thumb as soon as you see this mock triage. So I had a team of 5 people, not in the state of New South Wales, create 20 mock triages using the typography and the style of current triages around there. So they made them look messy, and that was perfectly fine. We got ethics approval, and the great thing about TCAS is it randomizes everything. So you upload all your triage records in 2 quick steps, and you then allocate it to an auditor. Now, so auditors were not guided by their success. They couldn't see any of the reports I showed you early on. They can't see all the pretty graphs. They can't see how accurate they're performing at all. So they're completely blinded. And TCAS was built to take a representative sample, and that's exactly what it did. It took the records and it made them equal in terms of age, gender, time of arrival, and triage category, original triage category. And you can see all the numbers all down the side, all lovely. We had to obviously assess the auditors first. How do you know an auditor is gold standard? So we did 2 things. We had the 20 mock triages in there, and all 4 of them rated those, and we measured that accuracy about 84%, but also we compared observed triage to written triage, and we got them to compare those as well, and they also came out quite highly accurate as well. So we thought, oh, okay, we've got some gold standard trainers here, we'll do this. The majority of audits were actually completed in 1 hour. We actually finished doing 635 triage audits in 4 hours. We've just completed a survey across New South Wales. Most people are auditing 20 records, and it's taking 8 hours. We then looked back at some of the early work around the triage scale about, how do we define accuracy? How do we define consistency? Are there any goalposts that we should be driving towards? If you look back at the NTS when it was first evaluated, they suggest that accuracy should be somewhere between 50 and 70%. When we looked at the records, there were some that had insufficient information that we could not actually audit properly, so we dismissed those, but we still had 95% of them. And overall accuracy was about 58.8%. It's just little more than flipping a coin at this stage. And it did vary across the 5 sites as well, quite significantly. Now, this is probably my only slide that I'm going to talk about a statistic, so brace yourselves. So this little doobie whacker, a kappa or a K, is basically a measure of distance. If I say 2 and you say 4, it measures the distance. So the further you are away from what I say, the less reliable or consistent your judgment is. In triage, though, it's not just a matter of numbers, it's also about urgency. If you are meant to be a category 1 and I've given you a category 5, that's probably more of a severe gap in terms of lack of recognition. And that's what this is. Triage has just got its own kappa. It's actually weighted towards more severe distance if you are meant to be more urgent. So we run the 2 numbers. So most of the research articles you'll see will quote a kappa, and we're 0.69, and that basically means moderate reliability. So we're typically in that one triage within 1 category, 1 and a bit category. But when you apply the severity rule, you're actually less than that, and in some instances, you're nowhere in the ballpark. So we thought there's a reliability issue here somewhere. And the TCAS, it's not meant to understand the nuances per se, because we know patients sitting in front of us may look different, may discuss things differently, and some things might be missed from the record. But it's here to give some sort of benchmark as to where problems might lie. The majority were actually under triage with one category, and that's quite consistent with most of the literature in terms of how we make judgments. And it might be, obviously, that nuanced relationship we're having with a patient that drives us towards a particular category. This is also one of the charts that it gives you. It's called the matrix, and it's read like this. You read it from the left, so this is originally all the category 3s. If you're green, it's where the auditor has agreed with you. If you're red, it's because you were under triage. You were originally a category 3, but you should have been a category 2. And you can actually click on that number and go straight to the records and actually have a look at those records and look at the feedback that the auditors have given in terms of there was pain here, there was a behavioural issue, this wasn't quite right and it was missed. But here, and again, as I said, no surprise, is the sort of over triage block. And again, you can click on a number and go straight through to those records and see what they're like. So we then sort of thought, TCAS can also look at presenting problem groups. And again, very consistent with the literature, chest pain, likely cardiac, was something that was most likely to be missed triage, so either under or over in that group, followed by anxiety, agitation, and abdominal pain, specifically in the aged care population. We did manage to put some financial programming in the background because we do like a bit of money when we can, but there are two ways that cases are weighted in EDs. If you're rural, if you're metro, we've gone for the most generic to give you a sort of a cost implication here. And what we found was that when we auditors reviewed these records, we were short by just nearly $6,000. In total. If you extrapolated that out, I'm sure it would be much bigger, but it does have an implication to how cases and activity-based funding are actually put together. One of the smart questions we wanted to ask, and this is more just, again, going towards the statistics side, this is not included in TCAS because it's a little bit more complicated, is that, well, why are auditors upping and downing certain triages? What is causing this to be fluctuating? And what we found was that the patients who were triaged as more urgent was respiratory rate and hemodynamic compromise. There were descriptors or numbers used that the auditors felt were being underappreciated. And it's quite a true criticism of the ATS. There's a lack of physiological discriminators in terms of numbers. We've got things like extreme, moderate, mild. And to me, to you, to someone else, we've got our own sort of metrics in our head. If you've just dealt with a severe asthmatic that's just had to be tubed, your ability to separate that from the next asthmatic you see might actually influence your decision. So it's given us some recommendations that maybe the ATS should be reviewed in some way, shape or form. And some from the survey definitely that we found was the most common feedback about the ATS was it needs physiological descriptors. Can we use detect? Can we use the SAGO? Can we use red and yellow and bits and pieces criteria? The most common reason why patients were triaged as less urgent was a description of low pain. So pain itself was in there somewhere. Now, as a form of external validity, and by the way, there is no external validity at all for the ATS, because it's a very hard thing to prove. You can watch and wait and see if people die. That's probably not healthy. That's probably akin to, here's a parachute made of rice paper, let's see if it works. You could do a head-to-head and just see what happens, but it's really hard to assess urgency and if you've got it right. But one of the areas that they did address was that certain amounts of categories should be admitted. And here's the original category here, and they're pretty much in the ballpark for this, which is really good. The auditors got a little closer, and there's a tiny, tiny, tiny difference between the how close someone was to meeting the certain percentages of admission. There probably needs to be a better way of looking at validating triage decision-making, but this is the one that's currently out there at the moment. So apologies for a tiny, tiny slide, but there's a couple of things I wanted to sort of have to start off a discussion around triage. We know that triage is vital, and there are various models. The survey of 122 emergency departments that we're just trying to get to grips with the results at the moment, but what I can share with you is the majority, it's nurse-first triage. There's a few others out there that have a GP/physiotherapy therapist component, and that might be more of a decision-making process as opposed to a triage decision process, but majority, it's nurse first. The TCAS can measure your adequacy, and you can use that information to improve training education. That's fine, but we also uncovered some other issues. And the first one is that not everyone has access to or equal access to a nurse educator or a CNC. There are some CNCs that are responsible for 37 ED departments, and there's some that are responsible for 12, 4, and there's a few that are responsible for just the one. So maybe access to triage leadership might be an issue in terms of accuracy. It might be impacting upon. Also, there's also individual feedback from RCAs, where suddenly it's a knee-jerk reaction that everyone now has to be a Category 2, but you're missing the context of that one particular incident versus everyone else. So maybe that's in there as well, and we're just trying to drill through that. About 80% actually are actively auditing triage. But when we asked people, so how many triage records have you got in your audit? It's about 950 per week presentations, and on average, they're taking about 20 of those, which is about 10%. Some sites are doing 1%, some people are doing 33%. Some people, they use it as part of a portfolio for junior nurses new to triage, that they do the audits and bits and pieces as part of a training education. But it's taking about 10 hours on average to get through. So if you want to do an audit, you want some feedback that you can actually work with and potentially within a reasonable framework. Only half were sharing the data, though, from their auditing practices monthly. Most were annually or if there was a problem. And virtually all of them were paper-based again. And when we asked, could you go back 5 years? Could you go back 2 years? Could you find themes and trends? No, it's all on paper. Some people were using Excel, but again, it was separate workbook pages, so they wouldn't have been able to drill down very, very quickly. The next area that we found from the survey, and again, which might impact on accuracy and consistency, is the preparation for emergency nurses to actually become triage nurses. It's highly variable. New South Wales policy, which was led with Sarah and a range of other CNCs, has a particular number in terms of how many years of emergency care experience that individuals have, which was set at 2, and does not include a new graduate period. Some were saying 1 year, some were saying 5. And interestingly, when you divide it between rural and metro, rural were less than 2, metro was more than 3 in terms of what it expected people to have in terms of exposure before they did triage. Feedback, teaching was predominantly E-Tech based, and we know there's questions about E-Tech's relevance to nowadays. I think it's about 10 or 12 years old. It's definitely out there somewhere. And there has been multiple attempts from ECI, CINA, and other interested parties to see, can we work with updating this some way? But that's not really led to anything anywhere. So most of us have now said, well, how about we generate resources? And we generate resources to assist people to train and teach and educate. One thing that struck us most, though, was that the feedback from doing any auditing practices very rarely got back to the triage nurse in terms of, this is a theme, these are areas, can we have a professional development conversation? Can we see how you're viewing these patients? Can we work with you in a particular way to improve X, Y, Z? Only 2% were actually giving direct feedback to individuals. TCAS can actually look for individual nurses. So you can choose a particular, let's say Nurse Smith. It will then go randomize Nurse Smith's triages with an equal number of everyone else's. So you don't know who you're triaging or who you're auditing. And you won't tell you who you're auditing either. And then you can go back and it will tell you what their consistency is. Because what we're often finding is that there's a particular impression you might have about a triage nurse that actually isn't borne out in the assessment at all. And I think that's sometimes unhelpful in people's career progressions in EDs. One thing that came back from the survey was poor physiological descriptors in the ATS. They wanted more preciseness, which might have helped them be more precise in their triages. But emergency medicine is a little bit messy. It's a little bit frayed around the edges. You are dealing with intuitive knowledges, gut reactions. You've got a patient that looks grey and pale. You're just going to go with what you're sort of seeing. But we felt that one of the overriding areas that TCAS could help and improve is that education and feedback element. There's no point in evaluating any service if you're not going to give the results back to people it matters most to, and then look at brainstorming and forming around what can we do to be better, to improve. TCAS can drill down on presentation types, it can drill down on particular categories, age ranges, nurses, to give you some sort of insight to what's going on. But that has then got to go back to your practices of education and how you train and support. No site is doing any professional development of triage nurses except new ones. When we looked at triage nurses, the last time they had their triage E-Tech type, whatever they had, was 7+ years ago. So there's a consistency element there as well that might be affecting us. We're looking at rolling this out via ECI, who's one of our partners, in December and January, so look on their website. We'll have the application processes and some other bits and pieces you'll need to go through. We'll be doing a feasibility and utilisation study as well, so look out for the invitation for those. And we will be helping to assist with CINA as well as ourselves, looking at updating resources and providing some support at that end to actually enable people to grow stronger and develop. That was the very first one we built in Access. I flagged this up, that change is possible. This was done, I don't remember, most people have been nurses longer than this. This was done in Office Access 98, because that's all we had access to. And so we got some money, but we did, and there's a publication that supports it too. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Wayne. If we can just pop over to Slido for a second. We are going to have a forum after the next speaker, so there was just a few questions that came up on the Slido. Make triage longer, take bloods in order to test, make triage longer, make it worthwhile, but triage doesn't lead to any action for patients. Nothing controversial there, Wayne.
No, not at all.
So I think we can discuss this further in the forum, but would you like to respond to some of
I can take the top one off straight away. So the great thing about TCAS, because it sucks in all data, is I can see where blood tests are ordered. People who have blood tests ordered do not have an improved journey through ED. They don't have if anything, they have a downgrading of their category. They don't have an increase. So I'm sorry. Make triage longer. We could also then bolt in ultrasound, CT, MRI. The sorting hat can only answer so many questions. I think we miss sometimes that triage is primarily for assessing urgency. There are, and let's just come up, there is complexity in those patients, but blood tests aren't a function of triage. I don't think they add anything. And if anything, they actually might alter the thinking processes of the triage nurse. They might be more task-focused than actual urgency-focused. But we've got more coming, as I said, the numbers are still being crunched. But triage doesn't lead to any action for patients. That's obviously local issues, local flow, allocation. Triage does impose on ED resources. If you say someone is higher risk or less risk, they get more access to resources. But as we found, the majority were over triage, which means they're potentially consuming more acute resources than the resources they actually need. We probably should look at a best fit model, look at streaming, look at nurse practitioners, look at physio practitioners, look at providing a service what people need. But triage,
hope we don't have to answer all that, Wayne. We thought we'd put some of those up just as sort of comments to see what people are thinking. If you do like some of these questions, you can push the little like thing, and if we get short on time, we can respond to the ones that we want to respond to using technology, Wayne.
Yeah.
So look, I'd like to thank Wayne, if you could take a sit over on the panel there.
Okay.
You have to